I'm William, and this is my crazy, vivid near-death experience that I will never forget. Part of this is me trying to piece together bits of memory. It's not exactly what I went through, but I'm trying my best to remember based on my notes. I've told friends and family about it a lot, but this is the first time I've done it in public. I also serve as a pastor for a sizable congregation, so pardon my theatricality. Okay, let's go. I will never forget the sky's hue. It wasn't merely gloomy or overcast. Rather, it was a furious orange that burned as if the entire globe were on fire. Perhaps it was skyscrapers crashing all around me, causing massive pieces of concrete to shower down. The air was heavy with shouts and smoke. I saw a tank roll up the street as I was running, dodging flames and debris, trying to keep up with a crowd of people who appeared as scared as I had fallen, but it had real flags on it. Not American flags, but ones I had only ever seen on the news, as well as Chinese, Russian, and Chinese soldiers with guns aimed directly at us. I remember thinking, this isn't happening here, not in my country, but it was the buildings and street signs, and I could tell this was my city even through the smoke. They were still ours despite being shattered and battered, and they were squabbling with foreign troops here, traitors who betrayed us while we were fighting alongside the enemy. I didn't have time to think. My body just moved. I saw a family pinned down by debris, and I rushed toward them, screaming and waving my arms in desperation to save someone. Then, all of a sudden, everything turned black, but that's only the beginning of what I witnessed. I've heard all the jokes, but I think the entire vision indicates a warning for the year 2025 that we should all heed. I don't appear to be much of an athlete, and Pastor Daniel is the man who is just one sermon away from having an aneurysm. I'll admit that I still take pride in my weekend biking routine because it helps me decompress and provides me. I had a big sermon coming up, and I wanted to talk about hope and how no matter what happens in the world, we're never really alone. The typical pastor stuff, right? Well, there I was, biking through the quiet back roads outside of town, breathing in that fresh early morning air. I remember coasting down this one long hill, feeling like I could fly, and maybe that's why I didn't notice the truck until it was too late, a flash of white after a screech of brakes. I wish I could say that I felt myself. Like in other near-death accounts, I felt as though I was flying up or saw a large brilliant light, but for me, it was more like flipping a switch. One moment I was on that hill with the wind in my face, and the next I was somewhere else totally. At first, I assumed it was simply a bad dream. I was in the center of a large city, like New York or Chicago, but it was strange. Recognized landmarks were twisted and shattered, as if someone had taken the entire area and smashed it with a huge fist, and the temperature was high. Dense, as if I were standing by a wildfire with people rushing around, yelling, and sobbing was a nightmare that resembled every negative news story I had ever seen. I tried to shout and ask someone what was going on, but my voice was drowned out by the commotion. Then I noticed that the soldiers marching down the street were not ours. They were wearing foreign flags on their uniforms, Russian, Chinese, and a few others, and the sight of them made my stomach turn. I'm not sure how I knew, but I did. This wasn't some distant conflict. It was here, and the following year, our nation was split apart and I was in the center of it all somehow, so this is where it begins. To become somewhat weird, I'm referring to the kind of weird that causes you to pause and wonder if you've gone insane or if reality has completely changed. For a split second, I was in that collision, lying on the road with the sky overhead, and then I was suddenly somewhere else. It felt like I had been taken out of my reality and placed in the middle of a disaster movie. There was complete anarchy all around me, with people fleeing in terror and desperation through the streets of what I thought was an American metropolis, but which one I couldn't claim that it was strikingly familiar, but everything was completely destroyed. As I struggled to process it all, I felt as though someone had turned up the volume to max. I could hear screams, shouts, and explosions in the distance, but above it all, there was a voice in my head that sounded like a deep resonant knowing that this wasn't some distant war scene, but rather that this was happening here on American soil and wasn't far off. This was 2025, and as I stood there, frozen in shock, people were pushing past me in a desperate attempt to escape from something. However, before I could inquire what it was, I noticed soldiers circling. The flags on their shoulders were from places you wouldn't expect to see teaming up, and there were Chinese insignias mixed with Russian patches and even symbols I'd seen in passing from Eastern European groups. I remember the chilling realization that they weren't our soldiers. They were in uniforms I didn't recognize, but their movements were calculated, confident. Whoever they were, they didn't look lost or confused, and they were here on purpose, sweeping through like they owned the place. Several countries were traveling together for the same reason, and they too had supporters, folks from this area. I started moving without even thinking, calling it instinct or a vision, but I had this unshakable urge to follow a group of people who appeared to be looking for safety. I needed to find a way out, not just for myself but for everyone around me, but I wasn't sure what I was supposed to do yet. In the middle of all of this, a young girl caught my eye. She couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 standing. Some of them were in uniform, while others were in plain clothes, guiding them as if they had been waiting for this moment. She appeared so lost and terrified, with tears running down her face as she searched the crowd, and I knew I had to assist. I leaned down and assured her gently that I would protect her. I wasn't sure if I could follow through on the promise, but she gave me a look, nodded, and extended her hand, which I accepted as we began to move together. Suddenly, I joined a gathering of people who had gathered in an alleyway, and everyone was staring at me. They whispered that they had heard tales of how this alliance had taken over communication lines, tech networks, and even power grids. They claimed that it didn't take tanks to bring us down and that we had been cut off before most people even realized it. What was going on with one man? An elderly, grizzled man. We didn't have much time to talk, but then abruptly one of the group pointed out soldiers moving along the street, methodically sweeping from door to door. The woman next to me whispered something about how they were rounding up those who wouldn't fall in line. He nodded with abandon as if he had seen this coming. He muttered about how the warnings had been there, how people had tried to sound the alarm about the ways we'd made ourselves vulnerable. As he spoke, a chill went down my spine. I suppose my instinct told me that we ought to keep on, but as we navigated the alleys, as we ducked around a corner, we noticed a huge armored vehicle rolling down the street. It was wearing what appeared to be surveillance equipment on top, and it was slowly scanning the area as if it were looking directly through me and all of us. I felt this unwavering urge to get these people to safety. I may have been confused and afraid, but somehow I'd become part of something bigger, something I couldn't abandon. I tightened my grip on the girl's hand because in a situation like that, when fear is running on pure adrenaline, your senses become more acute. You pay attention to every sound and shadow. Despite the fact that I was drawn into this vision or whatever it was from a peaceful bike ride, it felt like I had been there forever. Our group huddled close to the shadows as we made our way through the back streets, and the girl whose hand I was holding kept looking up at me. Her eyes were wide with fear and something else, maybe hope. That trust was like a weight on my shoulders because I had to keep her safe no matter what. We moved down a narrow alley, avoiding broken glass and debris, keeping our heads down, and everyone was whispering trading rumors, discussing what they had heard over hacked broadcasts, and whispered warnings. Major cities were crumbling as the coalition forces moved interior after previously capturing the coast. However, they had been planning this invasion for months, infiltrating networks and gaining control of vital infrastructure in ways that left the military reeling and our own forces out of contact. It was difficult for me to comprehend the attack because of its speed and scope, but as soon as we came to a break between buildings, the sound of drones worrisomely filled the air. They flew low, sweeping the streets with bright lights that flickered through broken windows, and we all leaned against the walls, holding our breath, as they went by overhead in vacant doorways, and I could feel the little girl's heartbeat, or perhaps mine, was pounding in her hand. While discussing how technology had become our biggest weakness, one of the older men in our group muttered under his breath that these drones didn't even require human operators because they were automated, loaded with sensors, and controlled remotely. It seemed as though they could read our every move. With a sick feeling, I recognized that these weren't merely arbitrary surveillance drones. Rather, they were out to get us, methodically searching for any indications of opposition. As the drones went by, we slipped farther down the alley. After the buzzing subsided to an almost unbearable level, we encountered a checkpoint with a group of Alliance soldiers stationed directly at the end of the street, blocking our path. Armed to the teeth, their faces concealed behind masks, and moving with the assurance of people who knew they were in control, our group froze, unsure of what to do. I looked around desperately for a way out when I spotted a narrow stairwell leading down into the basement of a nearby building. I nudged the others, motioning toward it, and we slowly, one by one, we descended the stairs, and once inside, we huddled together while listening to the pitch-black dampness and mildew odor. For a few heart-pounding minutes, I heard muffled footsteps above us. The soldiers were moving slowly and methodically, as if they knew people were hiding nearby. I thought they would find us, throw open the door, and drag us out one by one, but as soon as their footsteps faded, the woman next to me let out a shaky exhale, and I realized I had been holding my breath too. A wave of relief passed over us, and we dared to hope that perhaps we had made it, but then we heard something that froze. "The feint is where we are," They were approaching in a hurry when they heard boots on the basement steps through our group, but there was nowhere to go. The little girl gave me a wide-eyed look, and I knew I had to act without thinking. I signaled for everyone to follow me as I slipped through a side door into what appeared to be an old utility room. It was small, with broken equipment and pipes, but it provided cover, so we ducked down against the walls. As the soldiers moved through the basement, they were talking in low voices about orders, scanning the room with flashlights so I could hardly understand them, but I managed to catch enough. It seemed strange to listen to dissidents who had resisted. They discussed common folks like. At one point, they wanted to defend their families, which made them criminals. After what seemed like an eternity, the soldiers left, and the room fell silent once more. We all let out a collective sigh of relief as the soldier's flashlight beam fell directly on us, and my heart stopped as it hovered over our hiding place. I prepared myself to shield the girl and be ready for whatever came next, but as soon as the light went on and the footsteps faded, they hadn't seen us. This time, we had almost escaped, but the city was teeming with soldiers, drones, and other unknown creatures. Other than that, as we sat there catching our breath, Robert, the older man in the bandon, leaned in close and whispered about a resistance camp. He had heard of a group hiding out in the industrial district where people were fighting back. It wasn't much, but it was a glimmer of hope, a destination, something to hold on to. He suggested that we try to get there before daylight. Everyone was scared and exhausted, but that small glimmer of hope was enough to get us moving again, so we left the basement as stealthily as possible, slipping back into the dark streets. The underground base of the resistance was the city's alleys, with the weight of the world bearing down on everyone. The streets were eerily silent, the type of silence that gives you the impression that someone is watching you and that something significant is about to happen. It was surprisingly well hidden, like a forgotten corner of a once thriving town that has been recaptured by individuals who refused to let things fall apart. Robert took the lead, watching for any indication of trouble. Maya, the group's leader, was all business and didn't waste time on small talk. Instead, she provided us enough background information to understand what we were getting into. Since the Alliance had been advancing for some time and their power was growing quickly, I couldn't help wondering as we followed Maya through a maze of abandoned industrial buildings. I couldn't help but wonder where I fit into all of this. I wasn't a fighter, and I wasn't even really equipped for this kind of life, but I was here now and I couldn't go back. I'd seen too much, felt too much, and noticed how desperate everyone looked, but they still had that fire in their eyes. They weren't defeated yet, but I knew that could change at any moment. They appeared to believe I had something to contribute, and we eventually arrived at their hideout, a dilapidated structure with people dispersed and improvised defenses. I was still trying to take it all in when Maya led us to a corner where a few people were planning the next move. For a moment, the world seemed to be out of focus, but I shook it off because I had bigger things to focus on. I had no idea what I was doing here. I wasn't a resistance fighter. I was a pastor. Ed was everywhere working together, planning and strategizing. It felt like the center of something important, the kind of place where people either break or make something happen. However, I had to think that all I had witnessed and experienced indicated something. Perhaps this was the more I looked around, the more my mind wandered and I wasn't sure what was real anymore. One minute I was standing in a dark corner listening to plans for some sort of attack, and the next everything felt blurry, as if I were slipping out of my vision, as if the edges of reality were shifting. Why had I been shown all those horrors? Perhaps I was meant to help these people even if I didn't know how. For a split second, I felt as though I glimpsed a glimpse of my former church, something recognizable from my real-life congregation, a glimpse of my motorcycle. What was that about? I shook it off. There was no time for that. Now, lives were on the line, but something inside of me was beginning to pull away, telling me that this wasn't all real, not in the way I thought it was. All I knew was that I had to keep moving, but I felt a pull back to reality somewhere deep inside of me. Something was happening, and it wasn't just the chaos around me. We had been moving underground for what seemed like days. The opposition had a strategy through congested tunnels and keeping our heads down, but the eye became less certain of our chances the longer I lived in their environment. When we finally entered daylight, everything felt different. The streets were still eerily empty, but the weight in the air felt heavier, like a storm waiting to break. It wasn't just the absence of people, it was the absence of hope. Maya. Every piece of information seemed to be another piece in a puzzle that was becoming more and more incomprehensible. There was no clear path forward. It wasn't just a war against an enemy, It was a war against everything that had once been solid had brought us to the summit of a structure, and I was standing on the edge, gazing out over a metropolis that had been ripped apart. The air tasted like smoke, and fires burned in the distance. I suddenly realized with a sickening realization that we couldn't stop this. Not today, not ever, because the forces at work were too big and relentless, and we were minuscule, hardly a blip in the big scheme of things. Music. All I could do was look down at my hands when the world seemed to bend. Everything flickered like a television screen, and for a brief moment, I wasn't standing on the rooftop. I was riding my bike again. Cycling down a familiar path with the wind in my face, the scent of the country road and the pure air replaced the smoke. My heart thumped, but my surroundings changed it to panic instead of adrenaline. The world flickered like a broken light bulb, and I was suddenly thrown back into the chaos, fighting fires, soldiers everywhere, and the sounds of gunfire and screams. It was overwhelming, but I wasn't just watching. I was actually in the middle of it, running through the streets trying to help people, pulling them out of the wreckage. I didn't even know who they were, but I couldn't ignore the cries for help, everyone. It seemed like a modest victory when I saved, but it was never enough, and suddenly everything changed. Vision the conflict and the mayhem, the car horn sound began to rip away the reality, which was vanishing like a dream you can't keep on to no matter how hard you tried. The distant sound of a smash, the tires screech, everything blended together in a fading fog. I recall feeling my body jerk as if I were being pulled away from the road, the bike, and everything else, but it stopped as soon as the pull arrived. Had a sudden, intense ache in my chest, but it wasn't from a collision, at least not one that felt genuine. Rather, it was pressure. Like a weight on my ribs, a reminder that something wasn't right, and then I gasped, breathing again for real this time, but not in the vision music. In addition, the pain in my chest didn't make sense, and I wasn't sure if it was genuine or if it was only a relic of the vision I had just experienced. I wasn't sure if I had been struck by a car or if it was only a part of the nightmare in which I had been imprisoned. But as my breathing slowed and my surroundings cleared, I was positive that I was awake, or at least I was back in a place that felt real. But was it because the experience still weighed heavily on me as I sat there on the bike trying to steady myself? I wasn't sure if I had actually died, if I had been struck by a car in the real world, or if that had just been a part of the vision's last flicker. All I knew was that I wasn't in the middle of a war anymore, holding people in the streets, or trying to outrun enemy fire. I kept having the impression that something had changed and that the vision wasn't only a dream. It served as a message to the world that I had seen was approaching and that I could do nothing to stop it. I inhaled once more, the air filling my lungs. It felt genuine, but it also felt foreign. I couldn't go back to what I had known. The past and present were vanishing, and something else was entering that I couldn't control. I knew I wasn't prepared for what was about to happen, and even though I rode with the wind in my face, I couldn't forget what I had witnessed.